the discussing is exciting. Discussing. So let's start from the rootness mode. The Kubernetes and the Kuberproxy anything. So Aki Hero, do you want to talk? Yes. Do you want to drive the conversation here? I think Derek have the review that one. I also take a look this morning. Yeah.
So I don't know if he is actually on, if the author is on the call. I think Dims had just placed it on the agenda to try to get attention to it, and I'm not sure if Dims was aware of the previous iterations.
He's on the call. He just checked. He sent us chat, but I think that he turned off the microphone because due to the time zone, so he cannot talk. So okay. So I think that he already posted the cap, and I think he wants to call out the attention. And if both Derek and already take a look, I think Derek, do you want to summarize what you the impression or what's your suggestion?
Yeah, basically I don't know how others felt, but ever since our experience in supporting containerized kubelets and then discovering that as a community we weren't great at keeping alternate kubelet deployment models supported, and it was hard to keep this on our mental frame of minds, that taking on new deployment models without like a large enough group of us sufficiently motivated to keep it supported was a concern. So like the first concern was just like, what were the use cases for when and why one would use a rootless kubelet, and we think that there was a broad enough community of users as well as maintainers who wanted to support those use cases. So that was the first question, and I think maybe the CUP was updated to that. Then the second feeling I had on it was, given the prerequisite on Secrets v2, should we focus our energies on Secrets v2 first and hold on that CUP until it can be placed in a particular release roadmap window, just so that we could either iterate on that PR, merge it in some lightweight form that says maybe all the implementations aren't agreed to, but as a group, we think rootless is a good path to go forward. Like I was trying to just think, how do you keep a PR from languishing? And then relative to last week's conversation where some folks were expressing interest in a use case where a cluster admin only had root on a subset of nodes, it felt like a rootless kubelet was one particular way of supporting that use case. And so I was curious on other folks' perspective. That's basically it.
Let me share my feeling after I read through this one, and I think Derek, you already touched some of my concern here. I think that some of our concern, I think the author tried to answer through the CAP, but I still am clear it is in what kind of, I understand the motivation. Motivation is to mitigate all those kind of our Kubernetes component on the worker node, the vulnerability. But the problem is some of those components, it is lead of the privilege access, and we iterate. I think in the CAP, iterate some of those kind of things is don't have the cannot support, and some there's the proposal certain way to support. So especially like for example, for resource management, that's obviously one, and we have like I have the concern about we are kind of goes to the direction to over address of potential vulnerability. So here in this to the rootness for all those components, but at the same time we lose off the functionality how to manage node. Like efficient managing node, you end up to not efficient manage. Just for simple example, like you cannot really management of the resource and you end up like kill the whole node. You end up have like the over-committed or over subscribed situation and turn down the entire load. So that's another way of DOS attack, right? So that's security vulnerability type of the things to me. So I worry about unless we understand the full picture, full use cases, instead of like the simple say, oh, like the mitigate of the vulnerability. So there's many ways to mitigate the vulnerability, and also kernel. We are still run on the Linux kernel. Linux kernel could have the vulnerability. So I'm not sure how we are, at this moment, I'm not convinced about this way. And is that the right approach to go? So I like what Derek proposed earlier, say, let's define the, I personally want to iterate what kind of support, what kind of work, all those kind of things, and also clearly define what kind of the scenario in the production you want this is being deployed. There may be better, we can move forward. That's my first impression on this one. Team.
Yeah,
We have team here.
if I can add a few things to that. I'm definitely in favor of rootless control plane components. I think that we can run most of the control plane as non-root without making any changes to the functionality. And there's already some efforts underway to do that. As kind of more generally, I think pushing towards running more components with least privileges. So not necessarily rootless, but if there's capabilities we can drop, if there's seccomp profiles we can add to harden the components, I think that can go a long way. And there's actually some cases where I think running components as non-root would actually weaken the security. So for instance, kubelet talks to CRI or Docker over a Unix domain socket that's owned by root. And so we sort of assume that you need to be root on host in order to have privileged access to run things over that socket. And if we were to run those components as non-root, that would have to be a socket owned by a non-root user, and it's harder to lock down access to that then. Yeah.
I guess the same would apply to device plugins as well, Tim.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think this is the storage. The plugin also have some problem like this, also similar. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love us to be able to run the plugins themselves as non-root. I don't know if that's possible. But yeah, actually, that's a good point that if we were going to start working on running things as non-root, I think storage plugins would be a good place to start focusing that effort.
So in your this is to the author, I think he's doing this. So I like the Patrick's suggestion to find the define of the functionality, what meet your use cases. But I think that he based on like the virtual Kubernetes based. I can actually also similar suggestion earlier I mentioned. I want to say, okay, what exactly you needed, and then brought up because I think the mitigate of the vulnerability is too big. Like what I mentioned, like even kernel have those problems. So I don't want we are over address this vulnerability problem and end up to say, oh, build incomplete like the Kubernetes different model, but we don't understand the use cases. And then we kind of like the call out, advertise this model. It is more secure model and confusing the user. So everyone think, oh, that's this good model to deploy, and it cause problem. So then the community have to explain, actually that's not, you are trade off a lot of functionality and necessary functionality. You even maybe have like the problem with the resource management, all those kind of things. I think also in your CAP, I suggest let's explore to like for example, Tim just mentioned that start from the storage plugin can see that's possible. And in your cap, I suggest can we start from the SIG version 2 to see, and it's all those kind of prerequisite need, then we can explore it more.
There's a lot of stuff in the chat. There's a whole other discussion in the chat.
Yes, that's what I read from
Okay.
here. You already posted on screen.
I mean, given C Groups V2 is a prereq, does anyone on the call want to give an update on how that's proceeding? Or maybe we can focus, if not this meeting, the next meeting on latest updates to that CUP.
Yeah, Derek, so I think we can have Giuseppe come on the next call, but I'm seeing a lot of movement, at least on the runtime side, like run CPRs are going into fixing up issues on C Groups V2. And with CRUN, at least we are able to run basic pods. So if needed, we can have a demo next week.
Cool.
I think like Akihiro might be able to give updates on container D side. He hasn't.
So can we carry the rest of the discussing can you carry on the rest of the discussion through the CAP, since the author cannot talk at this moment?
I guess I'm wondering, like I've been trying harder to get through my list of PRs pending attention list in Kubernetes, and I don't know if we want to have a perpetual PR open or not versus do we want to close this PR in favor of understanding those additional use cases? Basically just like, how do we avoid having this type of PR just languish? And it seems like both myself, Tim, and Dawn were not yet fully convinced of those use cases. So do we want to scope the PR to just a use case discussion, or what is that the right next step you feel, Dawn? Or close this and maybe do a Google Doc or something else?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, close this one and go through the Google Doc, and then we can iterate and especially iterate all those prerequisites here. And through that Google Doc, that's much easier to come back and forth communicate, right?
Tim, you were talking about how there's lots of other things other than the kubelet that matter here.
Mm-hmm.
Is that something that SIG auth has like work done on where the security boundaries are, or how this would play into making it more secure or not more secure?
Not really. That's not exactly something that SIG auth owns.
Okay. I see. So every SIG owns security for the component.
Yeah. Okay. There's sort of a lack of ownership for kind of across the cluster hardening. Mm-hmm. So hardening of control plane components. A lot of that falls on the specific distributions of Kubernetes. So we've got some stuff's checked into cluster, but there's an effort to get rid of cluster. So I think it mostly falls onto the specific deployments. Okay. To harden the control plane pieces. I think for things like hardening volume components, I think there's some more like feature development that can make that easier, probably owned by some sort of collaboration between SIG Node and SIG storage.
Okay, I think let's move to next topic. I think. So Vinay, do you want to update the in-place vertical scaling? I think that PI is almost merging. It's basically, it's just.
Yeah, I had reviewed the latest updates this morning, and I think the last two commits addressed my concern, so it was really just
Mm,
preferring to see if it met Jordan's concern.
sure. Let's just make sure this is merged before 3 o'clock today.
Mm.
And we can even like meet the deadline, and we can iterate even later, because I think this has been going on for a long, long time.
It has, for sure.
So Renee is not here, so let's move on.
He's here,
No, Vinay's here.
Oh,
but he hasn't piped up.
Oh, sorry. I just realized my speaker was not connected. Hi, can you hear me?
yes,
Yep.
we can hear you well.
Hi, Derek. I saw your LGTM, and the bot ran a test, and there was one formatting issue in the CRI KEP. So I had to make a small fix for that, a very silly error. Could you please apply the LGTM again? And I think it's asking for retest as well. To run the tests again. And I pinged Jordan. I'll ping him on Slack as well and see if he's available to take a look at this and then review the KEP. Sorry about the additional work. I didn't realize the error in the KEP formatting, YAML formatting was there until you gave LGTM and it ran the tests.
Okay, I think everyone agree that it's good shape and ready to go. So we just try to make sure your CAP is going to merge before deadline today.
Yeah, let's try and do that. And I think for the code PR that I sent out, Tim Hawken already looking at it and gave a few comments, and I responded to it. So I'll continue working on that. So to get the KEP merged, I guess, I don't know what we need. I guess we need another LGTM label because I made a commit after Derek's LGTM.
Cool.
So that's the only, I'm hoping that's what we need, and Jordan's formal approval.
Okay, let's move to next topic. Patrick, do you want to drive in the discussion about the CI related runtime for Windows?
Well, so it's not just Windows. So we talked about this briefly last week, but Mike was able to give comments then. And so this is continuing the discussion around how we can pass runtime class down through the CRI for the purposes of pulling images and checking if they exist. And so KK did some updates there. Did you want to talk through those, KK, and double check? Are you actually here, Mike?
Yes, hey, Patrick.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, KK. Thanks.
So one of the concerns that was brought up was that list images and stats do not take image spec as a return back. So should we consider that as like including image spec in return? Is that something which we need to bother about? Was one of the things which was there in the review, and I wanted folks' inputs on that.
I think it should, at least for Canary, it shouldn't be hard to implement and keeps the API consistent. So I feel like we should do it.
Okay, so
yeah, actually, for example, if you ask Canary whether this image exists or not, Canary already needs to checkpoint the information somewhere so that it can return you the information, right, to check whether the image exists or not. And if Canary already has the information, then it shouldn't be too hard to return it. I don't need to go there.
So I'll add this extra piece where the list images would return image spec themselves, and by nature of that, when image spec is returned, the annotations also would be returned. That would be something which I'll add to the spec, to the KEP.
Okay, and so just to make sure I understood that right, so we're talking about, instead of having the two field image and image spec with different fields, we're going to just use image spec for everything?
That's what I'm proposing. And Lantau, you're agreeing to that approach, right? Like,
let me check the list right now.
so.
Yeah, I think we should, I checked the API, we have the image. So the image spec is returned in image status, but the list image only, it doesn't return image spec. I think at least we can add annotation into the image message. I mean, the one returned by list images. And we can also consider whether we should put the whole image spec there. But anyway, I think we should return the information just to make the API consistent. We can discuss how.
Yeah, well, yeah, I just don't know if I agree with that because, you know, the feedback that we had last cycle was this was getting too broad and we needed to narrow it down. And so, you know, if we make it as narrow as possible, where all we're doing is passing down the annotations, which would, from the CRI, just basically include runtime class down to the pull and ensure image operations, like that is the narrowest change we could possibly make. And so, like, are you proposing that we broaden this again or not?
I'm not proposing to broaden it. I mean, we can still only pass that runtime handler annotation. I just mean that to make the API consistent, if we create we have the annotation in the image spec, we should also retain it in the status. Or else it's weird that when we create it, we have this annotation, but when you check image status, it's not there.
Yeah, I'm just concerned that we're asking containerd to store some state without having a use case for them to store that state. So
I mean, that's what I mentioned. That for containerd to check whether this image exists or not, containerd already needs to store it, right? If given you like containerd to pull image, but it doesn't store what annotation is attached on the image, next time when you check whether it exists or not, how do I know, right? I have to match the annotation already.
So it can be the optional thing too, because when it's not implemented, it will just return nothing in those annotations. So
you're saying omit empty. Yes, fair.
yeah, I think that makes sense to me. So that way, if we're running with a version of containerd that's not persisting those, then we could return empty, and I think that makes sense to me.
Yeah, I think it may not be required because Kubernetes doesn't use that information today. But I think we may want to add it to the proposal, and maybe saying that this is content not used by Kubernetes, but recommended to have.
So is it okay to include this into the KEP and kind of take a phased approach where we don't modify the larger APIs as such, but the ones which have image spec we start adding, and then the next phase we kind of change list? Is that an okay approach to take so that we don't have the broader impact right away, but we'll get what we need to have?
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying that we only add these two image spec, and in today's API, we only be returned in image status.
So what I'm suggesting, Lanto, is that we make it as part of the KEP so that we have this as a goal, but when we implement it in phases, where first phase is always like we just modify the ones that we need. And then the next phase, we come back and go about modifying this. This way, we will be able to move forward rather than, coming back to the same state of whether we need to go broader or not.
Okay.
That works for me. Did you have something else, Mike?
No, I was just agreeing with the approach of, just putting the annotations in there. If they're stored, that's good. And it provides for the ability to do experimentation and extensions to the APIs. And then when those extensions become, more solid, we'll move them out of the annotations into, an explicit predefined, value so that we can add version check. Right.
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, I don't think we should add any versions or, data to the annotations, put it that way. Right.
Thanks, Mike. So we'll just move forward with that approach. I'll update the KEP and let's go through the process.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. And so we'll need, so since we're going to modify that briefly, we're going to need you to slash LGTM that again sometime in the next couple hours on town.
Okay.
And then I think we'll need Dawn to approve as well, since she says yes. And
Sure.
okay.
What's the Nantal?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I LGTM once. You mean I need to do it again?
After the make the changes.
Okay.
We are going to make change. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Okay, thank you.
so let's move to next topic. Next one is more like the ask our attention, Derek. And I know you already look at that one. I also look at that one. I don't know why you and I both lose the ownership to those directories. So I already talked to Yang and VG, and they supposed to approve your PR, and then we could prove a lot of E2E tests related of the PR. Somehow during last year, we lose all those. Okay, so then let's move to next one. Next one, I think there's the proposal to the Kubernetes option to system reserve the CPUs.
Yeah, this is Victor. Yeah, this is a PR that Vladik has pushed, and I think Vladik, are you on the call? Do you want to talk to this for just a minute?
Yeah, I can talk about it. This is basically not reserved CPUs, but more static CPUs. There was a previous PR that posted that allowed specifying reserved CPUs for kubelet. And then what it did that usually is supposed to be in the combination with the, supposed to be used in combination with the ISO CPUs on the host. And then what happens is that when you use reserved CPUs and the ISO CPUs, so then ISO CPUs prevent non-guaranteed pods, processes that run in non-guaranteed pods to run on ISO CPUs. And on the other hand, it also, the amount of CPUs that are reserved is being reduced from the overall capacity, allocatable capacity on the node. So then if the number of reserved CPUs is small, then non-guaranteed pods can only run on this small amount of CPUs, which can lead to very small, kind of choke on resources. And then if the number of reserved CPUs is large and the amount of ISO CPUs is I mean, relatively balanced, then this capacity, then we'll get into a scheduling problem because the capacity will be reduced from the overall allocatable capacity. So then instead of using reserved CPUs, I suggested to use static CPUs, which will allow the users to specify which CPUs are isolated And then guaranteed pods will only be able to get scheduled on these static CPUs. And it will not reduce the capacity, the overall capacity of the node. And the non-guaranteed CPUs will be able to run freely on non-static CPUs or on static CPUs if idle CPUs are not used. So that's a large story for this long story for this PR.
So I still was confused on this PR because and I don't know if you had a chance to respond to the questions I had on it, but my reading of this PR meant that the allocatable capacity reported by the node, only a portion of that capacity could be used by pods not in a guaranteed quaz class, which I first wanted to confirm that that is my understanding of the behavior. And then I didn't understand why that was a preferred behavior versus what I viewed the CPU manager doing today, which was dynamically shifting the set of CPUs it could hand out to exclusive cores based on the pods presently scheduled to the node.
Yeah, so for the first question, if we use only static CPUs, static CPUs list, what happens is that the non-guaranteed pods, they can run freely anywhere. This doesn't change the behavior. But however,
like
when we use,
a pod that didn't specify a limit and only specified like a CPU request, it could not run on those static CPU listings, correct?
well, it can. It only applies to the static policy. To the static policy, which basically works only on guaranteed CPUs, not guaranteed pods, not anywhere else.
Yeah, Derek, I think it's the opposite of what you were saying. It's that pods. And I get where Derek is going. Is there's a scheduling problem, right? Where a guaranteed quaz pod can come in. Integer request, so it qualifies for static CPUs. The scheduler goes, okay, there's enough allocatable on the node, but when it gets there, all the static CPUs that you've specified in the kubelet argument are occupied.
Yes, this is true. I didn't know how to overcome the scheduling problem because it kind of creates another type of CPUs. However, I view it as the same way as the topology manager works.
Yes, we have somewhat opened this Pandora's box of, having situations where kubelet has information that the scheduler doesn't and can bounce pods. But I do think that this is fundamentally creating a separate type, a separate CPU type resource.
Yes.
And yeah, and I get your argument that the topology manager has somewhat created that for CPUs and memory and devices and stuff like that. But yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, the main problem I see is that currently those who use idle CPUs on the nodes, they don't have a way, reserved CPUs don't solve their problem. And they don't have a way to specify that their guaranteed pods will run only on idle CPUs without reducing the capacity of the node. So the static CPU will kind of provide this way, but it will create a scheduling problem.
I have to catch up on the latest comments on the PR, but did you have a representative like config that you had in mind that this setting would be appropriate for? So it sounds like you're saying the recommendation for users that needed full exclusive CPUs, nothing shared with the hosting kernel, was that your ISO CPU setting needed to be in sync with the static CPU setting?
Yes, exactly. So the ISO CPU would be equal to to static CPUs.
And then you'd still be free to use reserved, system reserved or cube reserved or reserved CPUs?
Well, I didn't prevent this in the PR, but maybe I should, but I just don't know. I mean,
So even if a person had explored ISO CPU, if you had a host configured with ISO CPU today, does the kubelet detect those CPUs as allocatable even though it can't hand them out?
yes.
May I suggest this one? I think this one's deserve a type to discuss the discussing and the design and also interactives, how it is go with today's node locatable, and also the CPU, static CPU management, and also other things. So I really think what this is deserve a PEP.
I don't disagree with that, Dawn. I guess what I'm wondering is like, if the admin is expected to keep this new flag in sync with ISO CPU, is there a way for the kubelet to just detect how ISO CPU is configured without needing a flag?
I think
Yeah,
there are different PR about ISO, detecting ISO CPU. I don't remember the number, but I think I've seen it.
Yeah, it's in CSFS. We can just read it.
If as I don't disagree with Don that having a more like a write-up is I think that's a good thing, but I guess having fewer knobs is also a good thing. So if you were anticipating that ISO CPU is always kept in sync with static CPU, I'd rather just have ISO CPU be respected by kubelet. But maybe I'm missing a use case. So I don't know if you've done the KEP process before, but if you want to pursue that next, and then just as an option there, we ask, should kubelet just understand ISO CPU? Like we can weigh the pros and cons versus adding a new flag.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, I'm looking forward to your CAP, and we can continue discussing. And I'm looking forward to read that one next week even. So last one, I think the team, do you want to talk about the?
I mostly just wanted to bring attention to this. I'm hoping to get this into 118, but aware that the deadline is today. A handful of people have already looked at it and given it the LGTM. So back in, I think it was Kubernetes 1.6, we added this feature called streaming proxy redirects. And what we were trying to do was enable the exec attach and port forward streaming requests to work with CRI, and trying to avoid proxying those requests through the kubelet. So what we did was we have the API server sends a request to the kubelet. for say an exec, kubelet sends a get exec request to the CRI, and the CRI returns a URL where that exec request will be served at. And then the kubelet sends a redirect to the API server, which follows the redirect and connects to the CRI streaming server. And one of the problems with this is, one, it just adds a lot of complexity to the API server because of the way we need to sort of inspect the response from the kubelet in line before following the redirect. And it also opens it up to server-side request forgery, which is where you can basically get the server, in this case the API server, to make a request to some other endpoint that it shouldn't be talking to. So if you have a compromised kubelet, you can use this to propagate through the cluster by having the API server send an arbitrary run command exec to a different node. So we added the validate proxy redirects feature to prevent the SSRF attack, and basically says that the redirect URL has to be to the same host as the original request. It allows the port to change, but this means that CRI has to serve on not just the same interface, but also when it returns the URL, it has to use the same format. So IP address on the same interface in the same version. Actually, I'm not sure if it has to be in the same version. So anyhow, that was sort of the current state. And then we wanted to add authentication to that streaming server. And there was a number of different proposals for ways to kind of plumb credentials through for the API server to use MTLS when connecting to the CRI streaming server. And it was all very complicated. And we said the API server already has an MTLS connection to the kubelet. What if the kubelet just follows that redirect locally and proxies back to the API server, sort of getting back to how things used to work by adding a kubelet step back in there. This has worked pretty well. And so the proposal now is to basically make this the only way of connecting these exec requests to the CRI. And that lets us delete a bunch of complicated code and potential attack surface. The disadvantage to this approach is now the kubelet is proxying through to the container. And so, there's sort of two potential concerns with that. One is it adds some latency because there's an additional hop for the request. And the other is that it doesn't constrain the resources as much because as the kubelet is proxying the data through, it's using CPU and memory to proxy that data. My argument against those is that we're already proxying through the API server. And since the API server is a single or maybe multiple, but it's much more of a bottleneck than the kubelet. The kubelet has a maximum of 110 pods for the node, whereas the API server is potentially serving for thousands of pods. And so any concerns about kind of resource isolation, I would argue, apply more to the API server, which this doesn't actually fix. And as for the concern about latency, I haven't heard any concerns about latency. Again, we're already proxying through the API server. So I think that if you really need a low latency, very high bandwidth connection to the pod, I don't think that using the Kubernetes exec is necessarily the right way to engineer that anyway. So yeah, so the proposal is to remove that. The API server just proxies to the kubelet over MTLS. The kubelet connects to the CRI server over localhost so that there's not as much opportunity to get that connection. And eventually we may be able to just add a streaming request RPC directly to the CRI and kind of skip that whole localhost streaming as well. Any questions about that? Concerns?
I know, Tim, I had some questions on there that you addressed. I haven't had a chance to see the update.
Yeah, I mostly was answering questions. I added a bit more background as well. Just kind of missing the explanation the first time around. Let's see. So in the rollout plan, the only changes that I'm proposing for 118 are to mark the, basically just mark the features as deprecated and log a warning on use. So that's marking the redirect container streaming, which controls whether the kubelet proxies locally, marking that as deprecated. And so the default behavior, which is to proxy locally, is the way going forward. And similarly, marking streaming proxy redirects as deprecated. The streaming proxy redirects feature gate needs to persist for much longer in order to handle version skew between API server and kubelet. So that codec wouldn't actually be removed until 1.22 for a more aggressive timeline, or 1.24 for guaranteed safety. So since we're already looking at like over a year out to remove that, that's why I'd like to start the deprecation this release.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think I had joked that this was a dense thing to read through at the time I was first trying to read it. So I'll catch up on the table you posted, because that's probably the most helpful thing, at least that I was getting lost on. So but I think what you generally described here makes sense. And if we didn't have the folks in place to continue to see the existing feature go to graduation, then it makes sense to deprecate.
Sounds good, thanks. By the way, on the table that's in the background section, I'll add this, but the top right box with both streaming proxy redirects and redirect container streaming disabled is the proposed configuration. So it's the same behavior as the top left, which is the default.
The end state was that both the flag and the feature gate are gone.
Yeah.
And so that was what was confusing me. So basically the top right, that's the final state, no configuration done by the user.
Yep.
Because it's the one and only true way. Okay.
And top left is the default current.
And so present defaults match future end state defaults.
Yep.
And do we know if anybody else is using bottom left or bottom right that would be motivated to see it to completion?
No one is using bottom right. That would be broken. At least that I know of. And bottom left was the behavior prior to, let's see, when did we add? Prior to 111, bottom left was the default. So from like, I think 1.6 to 111, clusters were using bottom left. And I'm not sure if anyone is overriding redirect container streaming after 111.
Okay.
If there are any other questions, feel free to ping me on Slack.
So I assume you want to make the 3 o'clock here. So I think what you described is good from my perspective. So I'm happy to tag this now unless others want to hold.
Awesome, thank you.
Is there anything else, Tom?
Yes. Yeah, that's all for today. Any other people want to brought up? Okay, thanks for everyone and attend today's meeting and looking forward for next week. Thanks. Bye.